Hello everybody and welcome back to Sector 6, and today what I've got for you is the next episode in my background and predictions series, where what I do is I take a character from Final Fantasy VII Remake, look at their history in the compilation of Final Fantasy VII that already exists, and then try and make some predictions about how things are going to go for them in the future of Final Fantasy VII Remake. So far I've already covered Don Corneo, Aerith and Zack, and today I'm going to be taking a look at the leader of Avalanche, well, sort of, Barret Wallace. Don't forget to drop a like on the video and subscribe for future content, it massively helps the channel. I do kind of have like an internal goal of wanting to hit 1k by Christmas. It's probably a bit optimistic, but if that's what we shoot for, even if we get close I'll be happy. So yeah, don't forget to sub. But let's get straight on with it. Born in 1972, making him about 35 during the events of Final Fantasy VII and Final Fantasy VII Remake, Barret Wallace lived in the small mining town of Corel. And chronologically, his first appearance in the compilation is during Before Crisis. Corel was a mining town, and due to this, when Shinra came to them pushing to place a Mako reactor at the nearby Mount Corel, the townspeople were pretty solidly against this, as a lot of their history and a lot of their family traditions were kind of based around it being a mining village and mining being the profession. So they weren't really interested in what Shinra were bringing. However, over time, Barret convinced a lot of the people in the town, including his closest friend Dyne, that this was for the future of the town and it would bring them prosperity in the long term. It would make everyone's lives better and easier, and they can enjoy life a lot more. And there were a few reasons that Barret thought this way, but one of the main ones was his wife, who quite frequently suffered with illnesses, and Barret wanted to make life easier for them. And so, eventually, the town accepted Shinra and the reactor construction began, thanks in no small part to Barret's lobbying in favour of the Shinra and the reactor. And then we come to the events of Before Crisis. Avalanche occupied the construction site of the Mako reactor, with Barret being enlisted to help the Turks infiltrate the site and remove Avalanche. Now, eventually Avalanche were removed, and there are a lot of story threads going through this event. Like, there's so many different characters' story threads, but what we're going to do is we're going to ignore all of like the Avalanche side of things, and we're just going to stick with Barret. So yeah, like I say, Avalanche were removed and defeated, and everything kind of, well, sort of went back to normal, but the construction site was damaged, and Shinra were not very happy about this, and during the aftermath of the attack, blamed the people of Corel, accusing them basically of being in league with Avalanche, and they burned Corel to the ground, killing pretty much everybody. Now, Dyne and Barret had been out of town and they returned to see Corel on fire, but as they're kind of like letting everything sink in and kind of thinking, right, what do we need to do? They're attacked by Shinra troops. The two of them manage to avoid most of the shots, but as they're trying to escape, Dyne falls. Barret reaches out and manages to save him before he falls into a massive chasm, but Scarlet personally takes a rifle from one of the Shinra troops, fires at Barret and Dyne, and she hits both of them in the hands, meaning that Barret dropped Dyne, and Dyne fell to his doom. Now, Barret returned to the destroyed Corel, and he found Dyne's daughter Marlene somehow alive in the wreckage. So he decides to take her, look after her, and raise her as his own. Now, a short time after this, the next bit of information that we get regarding Barret is him getting his prosthetic arm. Barret goes to an artisan named Sakaki, and Sakaki designs numerous different arms for Barret, but none of them give him what he wants. None of them are suitable, so what Sakaki does is he makes an adapter so that Barret can change between the arms, because Sakaki realises that no single attachment is going to suit Barret's desire for revenge. Barret then finds his way to Cosmo Canyon, and he learns about Avalanche and the movement's goals, and he's inspired at this point to form his own Avalanche, to stop the use of Mako energy, to safeguard the future of the planet, but also so that he can get revenge on Shinra. And it was this desire for revenge against the Shinra that brought Barret to Midgar. Now, we do need to stop for a moment and briefly discuss some differences in the continuity here. Now, in the original, Barret reforms Avalanche and he's seemingly the only active Avalanche group. We don't see any other groups, we don't hear about any other groups, there's nothing. He goes about his mission, attacking Shinra assets in order to save the planet, doing his own thing, basically. However, in Remake, there are multiple Avalanche groups or cells that are still active, and there's a hierarchy, there's a HQ. It seems to be a much more stable organisation, rather than just one guy and a group of people that follow him like we get in the original game. Now, Barret seems like he joins this group in Midgar, and then rises through the ranks to become leader of a cell. However, after a while, his cell is viewed as being too extreme, and due to this, they're kept on the fringes of everything and not included in most actions that HQ go about. We see an example of this in Chapter 4 of Final Fantasy VII Remake, when Biggs and Wedge are kind of surprised to see that HQ have kind of turned up at the same place that they are, and they had no idea that this job was going on. So yeah, there's definitely a disconnection. So in the original, Barret is Avalanche, and in the remake, Barret is a little small fringe cell that's part of the greater Avalanche. So that's just something to remember. But that's all of the pre-story done. What we're going to do is we're going to get into the original continuity of Final Fantasy VII now for Barret. Now, Barret is leading Avalanche, and he's got a campaign going to destroy Shinra Mako reactors. And in the process of this, he hires former Soldier First Class Cloud Strife to help out in this mission. Now, Barret and Cloud butt head constantly due to Cloud's indifference towards the plight of the planet and the group. He's not interested in anything they've got to say. He's literally here for the money, and then he's out. And this makes Barret completely mistrust Cloud and sticks close to him to keep an eye on him. And I think this is vital to their bonding, and is why they become quite close as characters in the long run, because of this initial conflict between them. Now, the first bombing mission goes off exactly to plan. We go back to Sector 7, Barret talks to the group, pays Cloud, and then hires Cloud for the next job, which is another bombing mission. However, this mission doesn't go quite the way the first one did. The Shinra knew what Avalanche were doing and used the situation to their own ends. Cloud ends up separated from the group, so Barret and Tifa head back to Sector 7, and when they get there they find someone snooping around at the hideout. Now, they find out that he's connected to Don Corneo, and Tifa goes off to investigate the situation, leaving Barret to protect Sector 7 with the rest of the Avalanche members. And eventually it all comes back together when the Turks attack the Sector 7 pillar. Now, Avalanche and Barret fight the way through the Shinra. Barret makes his way to the top of the pillar, but unfortunately nobody else does. The rest of them fall on the way up there. But not long after this, he's joined by Tifa and Cloud, and they face off against the Turks. Now, the Turks, they know what they're doing, they get the job done. They set off the bomb, and Sector 7 falls, with Barret, Cloud and Tifa barely escaping. And this is another massive moment for Barret, because it's another example of where he's kind of led people to their doom, so to speak. In Corel, he originally leads the townspeople to trust Shinra and to believe in the promise of what Mako energy can bring. And now he's brought this Avalanche group that he was leading against the Shinra, and they've come to doom as well. So it's starting to seem that no matter what Barret does, the people around him seem to come to a pretty bad end at the minute. And we see a really emotional scene with Barret here where, he's utterly distraught about everything that's gone on with Avalanche, and it kind of mirrors what went on with Corel originally. So in Corel, he got his people to believe in the Shinra, and it cost them their lives. And now, in Midgar, he's got his people to fight against the Shinra, and again, it's cost them their lives. But you can only imagine what's going on in Barret's head at this point. And for a while now, Barret kind of falls in line with the group's goals. Initially, they go to save Aerith, and then they're trying to escape from the Shinra, and then he joins in the pursuit of Sephiroth, reasoning that Sephiroth is a threat to the planet and therefore an enemy of Avalanche. And also, he will get to continue his fight against the Shinra while he's on this journey as well. So he's completely on board. But it doesn't really get too much development for a while now. During the Calm flashback, Barret probes Cloud a bit further as the information's inconsistent in parts and it confuses Barret. And that comes down to Cloud being like an unreliable narrator, but that's a different story as well. We'll come back to that in another video. And after this, the next time that Barret really shines is the journey to Costa del Sol on the ferry, where obviously we get Sailor Barret, which is the best thing ever. Second best thing. Red 13 in a Shinra uniform, come on. But he's spying on Heidegger and Rufus, and he's kind of like this close and I can't do anything. You know, he's kind of going through that kind of stress. But nothing comes of it because Sephiroth arrives and we have to fight a Genova. So yeah, the Shinra, they get away, Rufus and Heidegger, they carry on their journey after Sephiroth, and so do the party. But not very long after we leave Costa del Sol, Barret comes back to the forefront of the story in a big way. The party arrives in North Corel. Now, North Corel is a new town, extremely reminiscent of like a small shanty town, and it was built near the Mount Corel reactor by a few survivors of Shinra's attack on the original Corel. Now, the townspeople recognise Barret, the few of them that survived, and they remember him being the voice that convinced all of them to allow Shinra in. He opened the door to Shinra. And due to this, Barret is assaulted by one person there, he's berated in general, and he's just told that he's not welcome there, basically, by the people of North Corel. But he accepts this due to the guilt that he feels for being the one that let Shinra in, and this guilt kind of stops him from fighting back against this. He fully accepts that it was his fault. And this is wrong because it's not his fault, it's Shinra's fault. But he feels that he has a part of the blame because he was the one that trusted them. Now we leave North Corel and we press on to the Gold Saucer. Barret continues to withdraw into himself. He lashes out at his friends due to the guilt and the emotions that have resurfaced now that he's been through North Corel. And Barret chooses to separate himself from the party completely. Now, the party continue going around the Gold Saucer doing their thing, but after a while they arrive at Battle Square and they find that there's been a massacre there, basically. Loads of dead people, I think there's a few Shinra troops there, a few obvious normal people, and they've all been shot. And the few people that they do speak to, they say that the atrocity was done by a man with a gun arm, and everyone is immediately suspicious of Barret. However, they themselves are thrown into the Corel prison because they were there, and that was it, basically. Now, Corel Prison is a harsh desert prison at the base of the Gold Saucer, and this is where we finally get the full story from Barret about everything that went down in his past. Now, the party are thrown into the Corel Prison, which is a harsh desert prison at the base of the Gold Saucer, and is basically the ruins of the original Corel. And finally we get the full story from Barret about everything that went down in his past at Corel. So we've already covered this, but we learn about all of that. And it's at this point that we learn a bit of new information, which is that when Barret had his gun arm surgery, the doctor told Barret that another man had had the same surgery, not long before, but on the opposite arm. And this instantly made Barret think that Dyne had lived. So we explore deeper into the prison. We find out about the man who's in charge in the prison, who decides like when people get the opportunity to try and win their freedom by going to the Chocobo race. It's a whole thing. We won't even talk about it now. But eventually we find the guy who's in charge, and the guy who's in charge is Dyne. Barret confronts Dyne, and they talk a little bit, and Dyne learns that Marlene is alive. And at this point, that's it. He attacks Barret because he wants to send Marlene to the afterlife so that her mother isn't alone. Barret obviously is unwilling to accept this, so the two of them fight, and Barret emerges victorious, with Dyne conceding that Barret is the right man to raise Marlene. And so he gives Barret his pendant, tells him never to make Marlene cry, and then chooses to end it all by falling to his death. The party eventually end up free from the prison with an apology, and they continue on their journey, and the next major point, we go to Gongaga, not much happens with Barret there, but when we get to Cosmo Canyon, we get kind of the conclusion of Barret's story to a degree, or at least the second half of it. We've kind of just had the first half then. Dyne and Barret kind of resolve the situation for each other to a certain degree, and while Barret still feels guilt for North Corel, he's he's reached an understanding with his friend, and that gives him a pretty substantial amount of freedom from the guilt that he had. But Cosmo Canyon, it's the birthplace of Avalanche. It's where he's already been when he learned about Avalanche for the first time, and he remembers about his fallen friends who he'd promised to bring to Cosmo Canyon, Biggs, Wedge, Jesse, and he kind of reaffirms himself and he stoically asserts that Avalanche is born again and that he's going to continue to fight for the planet. But like I say, he kind of, over the 2 or 3 locations that we've just been to, so Coral, the Gold Saucer, Skip Gongaga, and then Cosmo Canyon, Barret's kind of resolved a lot of his story. There's still little pieces that we'll get to a little bit later on, but for the most part, Barret is now done. Now, he stays with the party, obviously. He continues to reassure Cloud and everybody else and comes in with speeches about not getting off of that train when it's needed. But there's nothing massive that happens to him now, except for maybe a couple of realizations that he has. And the main one of these realizations is when we're at Gaia's Cliff, and Barret realizes how beautiful the world is beyond Shinra's reach, where macro reactors haven't drained the planet's energy. But then he also realises that he probably wouldn't want to live here, as he'd miss the comforts of home. And this moment shows Barret appreciating that while he does want to save the planet, there also needs to be some sort of balance or alternative in place. And it's very reminiscent of his attitude in Coral, because the reason why he let the Shinra in and why he trusted them was because he wanted to improve the quality of life for everybody, and this energy would do. So it's good to see that he's still the same person that he was. He just maybe has different views on it, and he's got a more balanced approach to things now. He knows that there is always the possibility of something bad happening, and he's got more of an understanding that there are consequences for things. Another moment is during the hunt for the huge materia, when North Coral's nearly destroyed by the Shinra, but the party saved the day. Now, this is a bit of a up in the air one, because you can fail this mission and North Coral gets destroyed, but I'm pretty sure that if you've got Barret in your team at this point, he has a couple of extra lines of dialogue, because he's got this connection to the people there, and it's another nice resolution moment for him. But in Final Fantasy VII, Barret's story is now done at this point. And then Barret stays with the party until the very end, his love for Marlene and wanting to save the planet being his strongest motivators now rather than revenge. Final Fantasy VII ends as it does, and after Meteor Fall, Barret continues to fight for the planet. Firstly, he was a part of the building of Edge, a new city born from the ashes of Midgar, which was all but destroyed in the final battle between Meteor and Holy. And then he sets off on a journey to find an alternative energy source for this new civilization that they're trying to bring to realization. He also revisits the man who made his prosthesis, looking to get a new prosthetic hand so that he can live a more normal existence, and the man tells him, "Come back in a few weeks, I'll have it done for you." During this time he meets up with Sid in Rocket Town and the crew of the newly built Shira airship, and they speak of a new potential energy source, oil.
No, God! No, God, please, no! 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 No!
But he also says that the area that they need to extract it from is in a dangerous area. There's a lot of monsters there, and it'll be a fight to get to it. And Barret realises during this that his fight isn't over, that he can use not only his knowledge but his strength as well to help the people of the world, and he instructs the Doctor to keep hold of the hand for now. And throughout all of this, Barret's been learning about the new crisis that the planet is dealing with, geostigma, and this leads us into Advent Children. Now, Barret turns up at the end of Advent Children, pretty brief cameo, just to help in the fight to defeat Bahamut Sin. And again, the next time that we see Barret is at the end of Dirge of Cerberus, where he, Cloud and Tifa lead an assault on Midgar and Deep Ground to aid Vincent in his battle against the Spheats and Omega. And that's everything that we've got about Barret from the original continuity of Final Fantasy VII. Now, in the remake continuity, there are some slight differences to the landscape around Barret that we've already discussed. But his character and his primary motivations and core character and everything like that, they remain intact. He is still the same Barret. I would assume that everything pre-Final Fantasy VII has panned out the same for him. Except it can't have done. And this is where this is a question that we're going to get to a little bit later on. We'll dive into this at the end in the predictions section of this video. But for the most part, like I say, Barret's actions and the events around him are identical to the original continuity. It's Avalanche that's different. It's the landscape that's different. In fact, the only major difference so far, really, that I can think of has been Barret being stabbed by Sephiroth at the end of Final Fantasy VII Remake, but then he gets revived by the Whispers, and it kind of leaves the change as a bit of a nothing change and a pointless moment, if you know what I mean. Like, there was nothing that came of it, so I struggle to even call it a change because there's no ramifications to it. Beyond that, it's just been an expansion of Barret's character and his motivations with more emotional speeches and shows of determination. And yeah, it's been really well done. It's exactly how I expected Barret to be, pretty much. So yeah, they've done a really good job with him. Such a good job with him, but that's not the point of this video. Now, the last thing that we see continuity-wise in Remake for Barret is him leading the group to calm, showing that character trait from the original where he and Cloud kind of playfully fought over the leadership of the party for a little while, with Barret not really wanting to let go of the leadership, but at the same time, he gets the story that Cloud is now the group's leader. So I've always enjoyed that, and I want to see a bit more of that going forwards. But that is everything that we know so far in the Remake's continuity for Barret. And there's a lot of ground still to cover. So what's going to happen? Now, there are a couple of obvious changes that I think we're going to see in Remake first. And the first one of those is related to the new threat mod. Now, I was speaking on the Big 7. If you've not checked out any episodes of the Big 7, please do, because it's, mint. But I was talking with Lolly Bunny, and she was telling me about in the new threat mod where when you start getting closer to Coral, well, North Coral, Barret becomes more and more nervous and more, like, do we really have to go this way? Do we need to go this way? And I think we're going to see a hell of a lot of that in Final Fantasy VII Remake Part 2. Like, I would be amazed if we don't see anything like that. So that's a minor change. It'll just kind of boost up Barret's trepidation of going back to see the people that he basically led down the garden path. He led them to their destruction. So, yeah, I expect... I expect to see a much more nervous and stressed out Barret. But the second one is something that I think is going to see Barret's involvement going much further than it ever did in the original game. In the original game, like I was saying, once we get beyond Cosmo Canyon on Disc 1, Barret is pretty much done. All of his major moments have happened, other than a few scenes in Junon at the start of Disc 2, where we see that meteor's coming down and Barret and Tifa are going to be publicly executed and blamed for it, scapegoat style. But that's not a particularly major event, really, it's just standard. Shinra tried to catch us, let's go. But in Remake, we're already seeing hints of a completely revamped side thread from the original game, and this is the Wutai War. Now, Avalanche seem to be heavily involved in the Wutai War, and just the general resistance against Shinra obviously runs through these two groups, Wutai and Avalanche. And we do have a lot of hints about how these groups are massively intertwined. We also have the inclusion of Rufus as kind of like the leader of Avalanche to a certain degree. How much of that is still the case at this point of Remake remains to be seen, because Avalanche seems, like I say, it's a very segmented organisation from what we can see, and it's how far through the organisation that power that Rufus has goes. I mean, we already know that there's one cell that he has no control over, or at least no direct control over, and that's Barret's. And this is a massive difference from the original game, because in the original game, the only resistance against the Shinra came from Fort Condor. Avalanche was just Barret's group, and they were doing their thing. I mean, in fairness, they were the biggest form of resistance, the party in the original game. But you've still got Fort Condor, obviously, but Wutai was done. Wutai was a beaten global power, the war was over, it was basically a puppet state at that point. But from the looks of it, if we see this continue to expand into a sizable story, it's probably going to run alongside the main narrative of find and stop Sephiroth. Wu-Tai is almost certainly going to be, in the same way that Yuffie is now an actual main character rather than a bonus character, Wu-Tai isn't going to be a side quest, I don't think. Wu-Tai is going to be heavily involved in the main narrative, and I'd be amazed if Barret doesn't end up playing some pretty important part in that. I mean, it could be that Avalanche turns out to be massively corrupt, as is kind of detailed in other materials like Before Crisis and things like that, with Rufus basically running the show there. So what's to say that Barret doesn't declare that he is the true Avalanche and his group is the true Avalanche and ends up in charge of that? There's a lot of things that could happen. It all kind of relies on what shape this Wu-Tai story takes. And speaking of Avalanche, there's one more thing that we need to kind of consider, and that is Avalanche is massively different in Remake to what it is in the original game. When did that change happen? Because it is a change, and in order for Avalanche to be in the state that it's in, it kind of implies that any kind of timeline divergence would have had to have happened at least a good 5 years before Remake or 10 years before Remake in order for Avalanche to be at the point that it is. Well, I'd say 5 years probably, but it could also just be that this is how they always envisioned Avalanche being anyway. So they're just kind of fleshing out the group to its appropriate size. It's never, to my memory, it's never explicitly stated in the original game that Barret's group is the only Avalanche group. And I'm probably going to need to check that. I've not been able to find any information on it now. I'm potentially going to have to play the game again to check that out. I don't think it is explicitly stated that they are the only Avalanche group. It could be that Barret thinks they're the only Avalanche group and Avalanche still exists operating in the shadows to a degree. But it is a substantial difference between the remake and the original game. It'd be interesting to know if that's directly going to affect the narrative, or if it's just kind of a we can do this now, we wanted to do this then, so we're just doing it. You know what I mean? Does Avalanche being as different as it is tie into the changes in the universe that we're seeing throughout Remake, or is it just a case of we always wanted it to be like this from the developers, so we're making it like this? It's interesting, and we're definitely going to get a lot of answers in part 2 of Remake for sure. Cosmo Canyon, we're probably going to reach Cosmo Canyon, and that is the birthplace of Avalanche, so we could get a lot of information there. At Fort Condor, it's a big resistance against the Shinra there. It's probably going to be some Avalanche presence there, so we should get a lot more information at Fort Condor too. But beyond that, I think we'll see very much of the same sort of Barret, but like it has been so far with Remake, everything's going to be expanded and fleshed out more, so I expect the North Coral scenes, they'll be much more emotional and much more in-depth. The flashbacks probably going to give us more details as well on what happened in in the original Coral, and Barret when he was convincing people to support the Shinra and allow them in. Not only that, like I say, Wu-Tai is going to be bigger. We get the whole gold saucer thing and the deal with Dyne. This is another thing that may change slightly. So I personally think the Dyne thing could go one of two ways, and that's obvious, and I hate saying this, but I doubt it's not going to stay the same as it was. It's either going to become quite a bit grimmer and a bit more heart-wrenching, especially with Dyne choosing to end it the way that he does, or it could be that they dial it back a bit and maybe Dyne doesn't choose to end it the way that he does. It's I don't know, because it is a sensitive subject, but it is also, it kind of plays into the themes of the game as well, about loss and about how you deal with that loss and how you move forwards from that loss. And Dyne and Barret are the complete opposite ends of the spectrum when it comes to this. And I think it's Dyne, I think Barret kind of muses on it in the original game, how would he have gone the same way that Dyne did if he didn't have Marlene to support him and, you know, for him to focus on. And it's an interesting question, because it is possible that that would have happened. But yeah, I think I've waffled on long enough about Barret now. So what do you think about some of these suggestions that I've made for how things are going to go in the future of Remake for Barret? Do you think we're going to see this massively expanded Wu-Tai war? Is Barret going to be involved in it? Because there's a possibility that this Wu-Tai war expanded story happens and Barret's on the fringes of it still, because just like he's on the fringes of Avalanche now. he's not really made privy to what's going on, and he's not allowed in, so to speak. Do you think we could see Barret finding that Avalanche is corrupt and led by a Shinra, so he decides to branch off and form a completely separate Avalanche now? Because, I mean, he already is pretty much an entirely separate organisation at this stage. It wouldn't be much further of a step for him to do that. And do you have any predictions about Barret's story going forwards? Is there something that I've missed? Please drop it in the comments below. Don't forget to drop a like on the video and subscribe for future content, as like I say, it helps the channel massively, and I want to get to that 1k for Christmas. Not only that, check out the Big 7, where I interview some of your favourite Final Fantasy VII content creators about their past, present and future with Final Fantasy VII. And yeah, I think that covers it. So more important than anything, have a great day.